Today we are going to present NASA's early stages, how it developed, and the NASA's space program from its beginning till the end. So this is a kind of a documentary, and in next videos we'll try to present those videos in parts, and later on in all the videos you will see various recent technological advancements by NASA. So let's start the history of NASA, how it started, and eventually now in this year where we are, what NASA is doing now. So in July 1969, the crew of Apollo 11 was preparing for the United States' first attempt of landing men on the moon. NASA, the space agency charged with making the mission possible, had existed for a little more than a decade. Apollo 11 was the first of six successful moon missions, the result of an unprecedented surge in scientific and engineering activity with remarkable spin offs. This is the story of how Cold War uh, paranoia and incredible expenditure paid off in less than 9 years. United States went from space amateur to technological hyperpower. In 1950, America, life was good. The economy's vast productive power had switched from making tanks, ships, and aircraft during the Second World War to cars and refrigerators. The United States could dominate in the world in a responsible capitalist sort of way. America had emerged from the Second World War as the unchallenged nuclear armed superpower. But there was a problem. The Soviet Union had finished the war with a giant battle hardened army, and the country soon had its own nuclear weapons, becoming the world's second superpower. Its communist ideology, calling for international revolution, was a direct threat to the West. Both the Soviet Union and the United States had been working to extend their nuclear strike capabilities by developing missiles technology. Here, the Soviets were too disadvantaged. Their primitive warheads were big and cumbersome. They had to design rockets capable of lifting much heavier loads. But in October 1957, the Soviets surprised everyone. The heavy lift 7 rocket had sent Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into orbit. The 83 kilogram sphere was equipped with nothing more than a beeping radio transmitter. 2 days later, the Soviets tested a giant thermonuclear bomb, and America couldn't help but link the two events. Gets the American people alarmed that a foreign country, especially in an enemy country, can do this if we fear this. In December 1957, America was preparing for its first satellite launch. A Vanguard rocket was to boost a tiny 1 kilogram payload to orbit. Coast to coast citizens were watching. It was an intense humiliation for the United States. Just days later, Soviet delegate to the UN asked whether America would like aid earmarked for underdeveloped countries. President Eisenhower had mounted a non-military rocket to carry his nation's first satellite, but the Redstone missile, developed for the army by Vera von Braun, was given the directive to salvage national pride with a second attempt. They would use the Juno 1. In 1958, free men everywhere lifted their gaze to Freedom Satellite. It was a success. Later that same year, the Eisenhower administration established NASA to coordinate the country's space efforts. Sooner after, NASA recruited its first 7 astronauts. They were all test pilots at this time. In 1959, the United States had attempted 20 satellite launches. Only 8 could be successful. In 1961, the Soviet Union sprang another surprise. His name was Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin. He would become the first cosmonaut on the morning of April the 12th. Gagarin was strapped into Vostok 1. It carried air and food for 10 days. If its recently rockets failed, Gagarin could last until his craft's orbit decade, literally in 108 minutes. Vostok 1 completed one orbit and landed safely back in Seoul. 3 weeks later, Alan Shepard was preparing to become the first American in space, NASA's new Project Mercury. Before dawn on May the 5th, Shepard was delivered to the launch site 2 hours before the scheduled liftoff. This would be the first manned flight of the Redstone launcher, but the Redstone did not have the power to reach orbit. This would be a suborbital, hot in the spirit of Cold War. Shepard had called his Mercury capsule Freedom 7. There were weather delays, and Shepard had been strapped into his sea for 3 hours before the flight started. Freedom 7 took him to a height of 187 kilometers, ending 15 minutes later. In the Atlantic, where the capsule was picked up by a waiting aircraft carrier, it was successful, but compared to Gagarin's orbital flight, it was a poor second. Then, after another 3 weeks, there was a further development. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. This seemed like a very rash proposition. When President Kennedy made his speech, his country had only successfully launched 12 satellites. The United States had made a further 16 attempts, which had all failed. The Atlas booster, due to take the first American to orbit, was still having problems. But a new fast-track program under the direction of German engineer Dr. Werner von Braun had been underway for several years. A new launcher, the Section 1, was an attempt to surpass the Russians' heavy lift capability. It would use a cluster of narrow tanks that could easily be fabricated using the tooling developed for the country's existing rocket fleet. It would also cluster 8 rockets engines to deliver the required thrust. The engine used was the H1. It was a direct descendant of the engine that powered Germany's V2 rocket. After the Second World War, Colonel von Braun and some of his team of rocket designers had surrendered to the American forces. With them came hardware and extensive drawings. Tests began in New Mexico using modified V2's blueprint for the V2's engine were given to North American Aviation, who implemented proposed improvements mentioned in the Nazi documentation. A spin-off company, Rocketdyne, handled their work and are still making rocket engines today. In developing Saturn 1, there was a change in the approach of the engineers. They were keen to avoid the high rates of failure that had occurred with other rockets. This meant that all components would now be tested exhaustively before undertaking a launch. This included the H1 engine, which was required to deliver 99% reliability. Finally, in October 1961, the first section was ready for flight testing. It was a giant first stage with a dummy second stage and nose cone. As it sat on the pad taking, fuel technicians were methodically checking the rocket subsystems. This was time consuming and would later be monitored by computer high speed